To begin thinking about implementing EDI in education, I think we have to start with intersectionality. The Bell article from week 3 defines intersectionality in the following way. They say it refers to the social, economic, and political ways in which identity-based systems of oppression and privilege connect, overlap, and influence one another. So essentially, it is how discrimination based on factors such as race, class, gender, sexuality, or ability, how each of those respective modes of discrimination overlap and intersect with each other. So for example, if a person were black and from a lower socioeconomic area, they're likely facing discrimination in those areas of race and class. And looking to the history of North America, you can see how, in many examples, class discrimination was also race discrimination. For example, this was often true of housing, where housing policies that advantage wealthy suburbs over less wealthy urban areas is simultaneously a policy that targets and damages African Americans, given that they disproportionately live in urban areas. So that would be an example of an intersection of race and class discrimination. But going back to that hypothetical person, if that lower class black person was straight and able-bodied, then they would not be facing discrimination in those areas, and they would have to be conscious and mindful of those who are discriminated against in those areas. I think this is such an important starting point because reflections on intersectionality prompt us to recognize both our own positionality and privilege, as well as those who are in greater need of support because aspects of their identity are not valued or appreciated in society. I think this needs to be the starting point for teaching if we're going to offer an equitable rather than just equal education. So in terms of how these considerations actually translate to classroom practice, I think that culturally relevant pedagogy is the solution. Ladson-Billings describes culturally relevant pedagogy as, quote, resting on 3 criteria or propositions. A, students must experience academic success. B, students must develop and or maintain cultural competence. And C, students must develop a critical consciousness through which they challenge the status quo of the current social order. As for implementing this into my teachables of history and English, for history, I think it means exploring alternative historical narratives, such as those of minority groups, where those narratives diverge from and sometimes contradict the values and notions found in the Canadian nationalist narrative that has been traditionally taught in schools and elevated above all the other perspectives. Doing so will teach students to be critical of official narratives and not to accept them at face value, but instead to consider whose voice or perspective is being left out. Ideally, they will take these skills of critical evaluation and apply them not only to their schooling, but also when they come across these narratives in media, such as movies or TV shows, or on the internet, in the news, and various other places. Now, this is not to just tell them that Canada is bad or evil, but it is to recognize that history is much more complex and multifaceted than traditionalist narratives would suggest. For English, I would liken it to a metaphor that an English teacher once told me, which is that when it comes to the selection of texts to be studied in class, students need to be exposed to both a window and a mirror. A window being a view into somebody else's perspective that is unlike their own, in order to promote empathy and understanding and to recognize the diversity of human creativity. And then a mirror where they see themselves reflected in the text, and they can be motivated by the feelings of belonging and congeniality that facilitates. So these are the ways that I seek to implement EDI into my classroom. But of course, this is not concrete, and it will need to evolve and adapt as more research is done, as times change, and hopefully as progress is made.